When a society faces a massive crisis, well, we usually expect to see a physical battleground, right?
Right, yeah, like concrete policies, protests in the actual streets.
Exactly. You can see the problem, you can point to it, and map out a tangible strategy to address it.
You can put your hands on it.
Yeah. But when you step into the world of digital extremism or online hate speech and organized religious prejudice, that entire physical landscape just evaporates.
It's completely gone.
We're looking at a battleground that is completely invisible to the naked eye, yet it has this terrifying capacity to just tear a society apart from the inside out.
And it is the ultimate test of a society's immune system.
Yeah.
Because you aren't fighting an invading army crossing a physical border. You are fighting an idea.
Right.
Like a contagion, really, that is spreading virally through the very digital networks that citizens use to connect with each other every single day.
Yeah, the threat is literally in your pocket. It's on your phone. It's sitting there in your living room.
It really is.
And that invisible battleground brings us to the really fascinating paradox that we are exploring for you in today's deep dive. We are asking this massive, globally relevant question.
And it's a heavy one.
It is. In an era where online hate speech and religious extremism seem to be spreading just uncontrollably, how does a nation actively build an immunity to it?
How do you culture a resistance to organized hate?
Exactly. So to answer that, we are unpacking a highly detailed multi-year presentation by a researcher who is affiliated with the Patani Forum.
Right. And for context, the Patani Forum is a really prominent civil society organization based in southern Thailand.
Yeah. And this specific researcher conducted an exhaustive study on the rise of Islamophobia in Thailand. And this spans from 2017 all the way through 2023.
So this is a longitudinal look. You're watching a society under extreme ideological pressure over a long period of time.
But what makes this source material so compelling, I mean, the reason we're doing this deep dive, is that the researcher made a massive pivot midway through their work.
A total shift in methodology.
Yes. They shifted from merely analyzing the problem of Islamophobia to actively studying the solutions that were being implemented within Thailand.
They stopped tracking the disease and started studying the cure.
I love that way of putting it. So our mission today is to uncover the unique mechanisms Thailand uses to curb organized religious prejudice. And we're going to contrast it with the, well, really tragic outcomes in neighboring countries.
And figure out what this means for the global fight against online hate speech.
Right. But before we delve into the mechanics of those solutions, we need to lay down a critical foundation for you, our listener, regarding the nature of this source material.
Yes, this is really important.
We want to make this unequivocally clear. The research we are dissecting today touches on highly sensitive, politically and religiously charged topics.
Extremely sensitive. We're going to be exploring state violence, religious nationalism, sectarian conflict, and systemic prejudice.
So we need to state right now that in this deep dive, we take absolutely no sides, we endorse no political viewpoints, and we endorse no religious viewpoint.
None whatsoever.
Our sole purpose is to impartially report, unpack, and convey the findings and the analytical framework exactly as they are presented in the original presentation by the researcher from the Patani Forum.
We're just your guides through the data.
Exactly. We're just looking at the source. So with that understood, let's talk about the sheer scale of the researchers' findings. We have to look at the logistical reality of how they actually gathered this data.
Because it's wild. Starting back in 2017, the Patani Forum didn't begin their work on the internet.
Right. They weren't just scraping Twitter.
No, not at all. They built their foundation through rigorous, on-the-ground, face-to-face fieldwork.
And they didn't isolate themselves to the Deep South either, which is traditionally where international observers tend to focus.
Right, because of the historical concentration of the Muslim minority there and the ongoing violent conflict.
Exactly. Instead of just staying there, the team went to 5 distinct regions across the entire country.
North, Midland, East, and South.
Yeah. And the methodology they use to navigate these, highly fractured communities is fascinating.
It really is. To get unvarnished, authentic data without sparking an immediate conflict in the room, the researcher describes creating a very deliberate separation in their focus groups.
A physical separation.
Yeah. So in the morning of a given day in a specific province, the research team would meet exclusively with Muslim groups.
Okay.
And then in the afternoon of that exact same day, in that same community, they would hold a separate focus group exclusively with Buddhist participants.
Let's just pause on the mechanics of that. By separating the groups like that, you remove the performative aspect, right? Or the immediate defensiveness that happens when opposing groups are sitting in the same room.
Exactly. You allow people to speak their fears and their prejudices without a filter.
And they maintain this exhausting, highly localized ground game for 2 consecutive years, throughout 2017 and 2018.
Which is an incredible amount of work. And that meticulous process yielded 2 major foundational reports.
The red and pink reports.
Right. The first was referred to as the Red Cover Report, and that was designed to isolate and understand the raw mechanics of anti-Islam sentiment in Thailand.
And then the pink one.
The Pink Cover Report shifted the analytical lens to examine the fragile two-way relationship and the daily interactions between Buddhists and Muslims.
So one is about the raw sentiment, and the other is about the actual daily relationship.
Exactly. And they took all this raw data and collaborated with Thai academia to produce an edited volume called Religions and Violence, which crossed linguistic and religious lines to document the reality on the ground.
So they established this incredible baseline of how people interact in the physical world. But then the researcher notes this chilling shift. The landscape just completely changes beneath their feet.
It just morphed. The methodology of holding community focus groups actually became insufficient.
Because Islamophobia in Thailand had evolved, it entered what the source calls a different phase. It mutated into an organized, digitized phenomenon. Right, so the physical proximity of a community didn't really matter as much anymore because those geographic boundaries were just erased by the internet.
Yeah, the research team began witnessing an overwhelming volume of hate speech against Muslims proliferating online.
So to track this new invisible battleground, they had to abandon the on-site focus groups and transition entirely to online monitoring.
But they didn't just start randomly cataloging bad tweets or Facebook posts.
No. The source details how they adopted a highly specific, rigorous framework that is actually affiliated with Harvard University.
Right, the Dangerous Speech Project.
Yes, and I want to understand the mechanics of this because the term dangerous speech implies a legal or socio-political escalation that goes way beyond your garden-variety internet hate speech.
Oh, absolutely. It is a critical escalation. The Harvard framework differentiates the two based on outcome and intent.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, hate speech is abhorrent, obviously, but it is often an expression of personal bias or generalized animosity.
Just general bigotry online.
Right. But dangerous speech, on the other hand, is defined by its capacity to catalyze actual violence. It is rhetoric that is actively, structurally increasing the risk that a specific audience will condone or directly participate in violence against members of another target group.
So it's not just someone saying, I don't like this group. It's someone saying, this group is a literal threat to your family and you need to physically remove them.
Precisely. It's a call to action. So the research team started building these complex digital dashboards to monitor the severity of this rhetoric.
Dashboards specifically tracking calls to violence.
Yeah, categorizing the language based on its potential to incite real-world harm. They even began working with counterparts in neighboring Myanmar to establish a comparative perspective.
Because Myanmar was dealing with something very similar.
Exactly. They were tracking how these exclusionary movements were utilizing dangerous speech to impact national policy agendas across borders.
Okay, so they're building dashboards, they're analyzing the mechanics of incitement, they were basically staring directly into the engine of societal hatred every single day.
Every single day.
And that brings us to an incredibly vulnerable, striking confession from the source material. It's something you rarely see in objective academic reporting.
It really stands out.
The researcher states that the team hit an absolute breaking point.
The specific term the researcher used to describe the state of their team was toxic.
Our team has been toxic. I mean, think about the psychological reality of that for a second.
It's heavy.
When your entire professional existence is dedicated to collecting data on human hatred, when you wake up and your job is to read thousands of messages calling for the eradication of a minority group, it seeps into your psychology.
It profoundly damaged the team's mental health. The researcher openly admits they were exhausted and fundamentally broken by consuming toxic words every single day.
And this phenomenon highlights a severe, often overlooked vulnerability in this kind of sociological research. We see similar psychological deterioration in, content moderators for major social media platforms.
Yes, exactly.
The people sitting in server farms whose sole job is to view the most horrific content humanity produces and click delete so the rest of us don't have to see it.
It causes severe secondary trauma.
Yeah. And looking at the researcher's confession here, It forces a massive structural question. If the act of merely diagnosing the disease psychologically destroys the doctors, how does a society ever formulate a cure?
Right. You can't heal a society if the observers are too damaged to even finish the study.
So that realization formed an immovable wall for the Patani Forum team, and the situation was compounded by a profound lack of institutional support.
Yeah, the researcher noted that from their perspective on the ground, Muslim authorities in Thailand seemed either apathetic to the rising digital threat or they were adopting a highly defensive, reactive posture that just wasn't actually mitigating the Islamophobia.
So the researchers are burning out, the authorities are defensive, the dashboards are literally lighting up with dangerous speech. That trifecta of failure forces the massive pivot we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive.
They realized that staring into the abyss of the problem was yielding diminishing returns, and it was costing them their sanity.
Yeah.
So they changed the central question of their entire years-long study. Instead of asking how is Islamophobia spreading, they began asking how is Thailand actually culturing Islamophobia?
And by culturing, just to clarify, they meant how is the society actively combating it, absorbing it, or creating an environment that pushes back against this organized hate?
Exactly. Culturing as in cultivating an immune response.
Okay, so to understand how a nation builds an immunity to prejudice, we first have to map the exact genetic makeup of that prejudice.
Right.
And the source makes it abundantly clear that if you are approaching this through a Western, Eurocentric lens, you'll fundamentally misunderstand the conflict. You have to throw your assumptions out the window.
This reframing is essential. The researcher draws on prominent scholars, specifically MTS Yusuf and Osman, to delineate a sharp historical distinction between Western Islamophobia and Asian Islamophobia.
Because when a Western audience hears the term Islamophobia, the historical and cultural scaffolding driving that concept is deeply ingrained.
Yeah, it's very specific.
The text points out that Western Islamophobia is historically anchored to massive geopolitical touchstones. The Crusades, historical tensions with Christianity and Judaism, and in the modern era, the post-9/11 war on terror.
Right. The actors, the rhetoric, the fears, they're all built on that specific historical bedrock.
But step into the Asian context, specifically the Southeast Asian region analyzed in this study, and that bedrock just vanishes.
Completely. The driver of the prejudice is entirely different. The researcher points out that Asian Islamophobia is heavily driven by historical frictions with Hinduism, and most significantly for Thailand, by a movement they categorize as EBP.
EBP, Exclusionary Buddhist Protectionism.
That's the one.
Let me just stop you right there, because for a lot of people listening to this, the phrase exclusionary Buddhist protectionism sounds like an absolute oxymoron.
Oh, for sure.
Buddhism's global public relations image is practically synonymous with mindfulness, nonviolence, and, meditation retreats. How does an ideology of peaceful detachment mutate into exclusionary protectionism?
It's jarring, but it requires an understanding of how religious history is weaponized by nationalist movements.
Oh.
The source highlights a fascinating, highly specific historical narrative used by EBP groups to justify their ideology. They don't talk about 9/11 or the Middle East.
Right.
Instead, they point to the fall of Nalanda.
Nalanda. Let's unpack that, because this is a really deep historical cut.
It really is. Nalanda was a massive, ancient, and highly revered Buddhist monastic university located in India.
Okay.
It was a global center of learning for centuries. Its historical destruction, which occurred roughly around the late 12th century, is actively exhumed and utilized as a potent narrative tool by modern protectionist groups in Thailand today.
Wait, so they are reaching back nearly a millennia to an entirely different country to justify modern political action in Southeast Asia?
Exactly, the mechanism. The researcher specifically cites a modern thesis referenced within these nationalist circles titled Tailing Tampon.
Tailing Tampon.
Yes, and notably, this thesis was published under a pseudonym.
Ah.
It utilizes the destruction of ancient Nalanda to formulate a sweeping modern narrative that Muslims are the historical and inherent cause of the decline of Buddhism.
The use of a pseudonym for that thesis is a massive tell.
It really is.
It suggests that the author knows the arguments are either academically fraudulent or socially incendiary enough to require anonymity. But the narrative serves its purpose, right? It creates a historical grievance.
Exactly. They are telling their followers, look at what happened to Nalanda 1,000 years ago. That is the empirical proof that this minority group is an existential threat to our religion today.
It creates a perpetual state of victimhood, like a perceived siege.
Right. The foundational argument of EBP is that Buddhism is not in a state of natural evolution. It is in a state of active decline, and the sole architect of that decline is the presence and growth of the Muslim minority.
Which brings us back to that massive cognitive dissonance regarding the nature of Buddhism itself. We mentioned the Western stereotype of universal Buddhist pacifism. The text actually addresses this academic debate directly, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. The researcher references a scholar named Chao Kai, who encapsulated this global perception by arguing that Buddhism is a serial religion.
A serial religion. What does that mean in this context?
Well, in this context, serial means it is inherently porous, adaptable, and naturally geared toward peaceful coexistence and blending with other cultures and faiths.
Like it easily mixes with whatever it's poured into.
Yes, exactly.
But the reality on the ground, observed during the researcher's fieldwork, totally shatters that serial religion theory.
Completely shatters it. The researcher points to the work of other field scholars, specifically Duncan McCargo and Michael Jerrison. They spent extensive time embedded in the conflict zones of the South and the emerging contentious areas in the north of Thailand.
And what did they find?
Their empirical findings violently challenged the narrative of a universally peaceful Buddhism. They documented stark instances of Buddhist chauvinism.
Wow.
Jerrison went so far as to coin the term militant Buddhism.
Militant Buddhism. Again, a phrase that feels structurally impossible to someone who only knows Buddhism through pop culture. But the text backs this up with terrifying specifics.
It does. The field studies actually documented instances of Buddhist monks advocating for the arming of their followers.
Wow.
Yeah. The source demands that we discard the romanticized, singular idea of a universally peaceful religion and face the reality of the data.
Right. The data says there is a faction, this exclusionary Buddhist protectionist movement, that is highly organized, digitally mobilized, and absolutely willing to embrace militancy against a perceived existential threat.
Exactly.
So we've isolated the historical engine here. We see how ancient Indian history is weaponized into modern Thai nationalism. But theory and digital rhetoric only go so far, right?
Right.
What are the actual mechanics of this? How does exclusionary Buddhist protectionism actually manifest on the physical streets of Thailand?
The researcher provides a very clear tactical map of how EBP operates. They note that the movement focuses its mobilization and protests around 4 specific tangible targets.
Okay, what are the 4 targets?
First, they aggressively protest the construction of any new mosques.
Okay.
Second, they organize campaigns against the wearing of the hijab in public or professional spaces.
Right.
Third, they launch economic attacks on halal logos and certifications. And fourth, they attempt to legally abolish Islamic laws operating within the country.
As a crucial point of context here for you listening, the source mentions that Thailand currently has at least 2 sets of Islamic law in operation, specifically regarding family and inheritance matters in certain regions.
Yeah, that's important context.
So when EBP groups target Islamic law, they aren't fighting some hypothetical future threat. They're attempting to dismantle an already existing pluralistic legal framework.
Exactly. And the tactical shift from online rhetoric to physical disruption is mapped out chronologically in the source.
Right.
And the geography of this escalation is really critical here. If you were just looking at historical data, you would assume all these protests were happening in the Deep South, right?
The violent ethno-nationalist insurgency has been centered for decades.
Exactly. But the researcher completely upends that assumption. They trace the starting point of this new organized digital to physical EBP movement to the year 2012.
And the flashpoint wasn't in the South.
No, it was in the far north, in Chiang Rai, which is a province that borders Myanmar.
That geographical shift is literally the canary in the coal mine.
Oh, absolutely.
In 2012, a group of Buddhists in the Vian Pelpao district of Chiang Rai organized a highly coordinated protest explicitly to block the construction of a new mosque.
Yeah.
And the researcher identifies this as a watershed moment, like perhaps the first major organized protest of its specific kind in that northern region.
The ideology was breaking out of its historical containment zone,
Yeah.
and it didn't stay isolated to Chiang Rai either. It metastasized to another northern province, Nan.
And the rhetoric used in the Nan campaign is just staggering in its bluntness.
Yeah. The campaign in Nan explicitly declared, here is a province of Buddhism.
Wow.
The foundational logic driving the protest, which the researcher highlights as a core tenet of EBP, was the explicit sentiment that when there is Buddhism, Islam is a threat.
It is a total zero-sum game in their ideology. The mere presence of the minority is viewed as an act of aggression.
Exactly. And once that zero-sum ideology takes root in local communities, it quickly scales up to attack state-level economic infrastructure.
Let's look at the mechanics of what happened in Chiang Mai with the halal industrial estate, because this is a massive escalation.
It really is.
This wasn't just a small community trying to build a local place of worship. This was a state-invested economic project. The Thai government saw an economic opportunity in the global halal market, and they wanted to invest state funds to build this industrial estate.
And the EBP movement recognized the threat of the minority gaining institutional economic power.
Right.
The source details how 12 distinct Buddhist organizations mobilized in a coordinated fashion. They didn't just post angry messages on Facebook, they ran a sophisticated campaign.
Wow. 12 organizations.
Yes. They organized massive protests, they applied relentless political pressure, and this is the crazy part, they were entirely successful.
Wait, really?
Yes. The state, bowing to the pressure of these nationalist organizations, was forced to completely shut down the halal industrial estate project.
Let's just absorb the magnitude of that for a second. An organized online hate movement managed to dictate state economic policy and kill a government-funded industrial project.
That is immense tangible power.
It is. And we see that power flexed not just against infrastructure, but against high-level political figures.
Yeah.
The source provides a remarkably recent anecdote about the governor of Bangkok.
Right, and to set the context for this, the governor of Bangkok is not a Muslim. He is a Buddhist.
Okay.
But as the leader of a major global metropolis, he engages in standard diplomatic and economic functions. He attended an event organized by the Saudi embassy in Bangkok, and the purpose of the event was simply to promote Muslim-friendly tourism destinations.
Just a completely standard, mutually beneficial economic tourism event.
Exactly.
But while he was there, engaging in this, performative diplomacy, he wore a traditional thobe.
Yes. And the backlash generated by the Buddhist nationalist movement was instantaneous and ferocious. They launched protests against a Buddhist governor simply for displaying what they termed Muslimness.
Muslimness, it's such a revealing word.
It really is.
They were demanding public explanations for why a Buddhist official would wear a thobe, aggressively questioning if he had secretly converted to Islam.
Right.
I mean, it demonstrates how incredibly hypersensitive and reactive the EBP movement has become. They view any visibility, any cultural accommodation, or even basic diplomatic courtesy toward Islamic culture as a direct assault on Buddhist supremacy.
Exactly. So you see the escalation pattern here. Protesting buildings, shutting down state economic projects, attacking the cultural displays of top officials.
But then it gets worse.
Yeah, the researcher details an era where this movement plunged into something far darker and more dangerous.
Right.
They highlight a deeply disturbing period between 2015 and 2017 centered around a single figure, a monk named Epichat. The source categorizes this as the Epichat phenomenon.
This is where that Harvard dangerous speech framework we talked about stops being an academic theory and becomes a terrifying reality.
Oh, absolutely.
Epichat wasn't just complaining about halal logos. He was using his immense religious authority and his digital platform to issue direct, violent calls to action.
The quotes the researcher pulled directly from Epichat's Facebook posts are just chilling. He was directly addressing his massive following, asking them point blank, "Do you want war?"
Wow.
He instructed Buddhists to begin arming themselves. He openly asked his followers if they wanted to violently separate from the Muslim population and then crossed every conceivable line by asking, "Do you really want Buddhists to burn your mosque? Do you want Buddhists to really burn your house?"
How does a religious figure get away with literally calling for arson and warfare on a public platform?
Well, part of it is the linguistic manipulation he used to dehumanize the target.
Right. The researcher points out that alongside the calls for violence, Epichat heavily utilized a specific derogatory slur to alienate the Muslim population.
Yeah, the word kaik.
Click?
Yes. The linguistic mechanics of that word are vital to understand. Translated directly, kaik means visitor or guest.
And the cruelty lies entirely in that translation because the Muslim populations we're talking about in Thailand are citizens. They are indigenous. Their families have lived in these regions for generations, centuries in some cases. But by weaponizing the term cake, Epichat and the EBP movement are rhetorically stripping these citizens of their nationality and their fundamental right to belong.
It is the linguistic foundation required to justify physical violence.
Right.
Because if you can convince your followers that their neighbors are not actually their countrymen, but merely visitors who have overstayed their welcome and are now threatening the host, Well, it becomes psychologically permissible to forcefully evict them.
You aren't attacking a fellow citizen. You are repelling an invader.
Exactly. Apichat made this explicit posting a threat from other religions invade our Buddhism already. Please take arm near you. Come and defend Buddhism.
Okay, taking all of this empirical data, the geographic spread to the north, the economic sabotage in Chiang Mai, the linguistic stripping of citizenship, and the overt calls for armed conflict by religious figures. The researcher synthesizes the reality of Thailand by dividing the country into 3 distinct sociological zones.
Yes. First, you have the historical violent zone, located in the Deep South, where ethno-nationalist insurgency has long been entrenched.
Okay.
Second, you have the coexisting areas. These are regions scattered throughout the country where, despite the digital noise, Muslims and Buddhists continue to live side by side without major systemic friction.
Right, the peace holds there.
But the most alarming development identified by the study is the rapid emergence of the third zone, the contentious areas.
Right, these contentious areas are the new battlegrounds. These are the regions in the north, or metropolitan hubs like Bangkok, where these EBP flashpoints are erupting, creating entirely new fissures in communities that previously experienced peace.
So we have mapped a highly organized, digitally savvy movement capable of economic sabotage, led by figures inciting armed violence, successfully spreading into new geographic territories.
Which naturally leads to the most perplexing fundamental question of this entire deep dive. It's the question that caused the researcher to pivot their entire methodology in the first place.
Yeah.
When you look at those ingredients, religious nationalism, a sizable minority population, coordinated digital hate, and influential leaders demanding arson, that is the exact historical recipe for absolute catastrophe.
It is.
It is the precursor to systemic state violence and ethnic cleansing. Yet Thailand has not spiraled into that abyss.
Right.
The society has shuddered, but it hasn't fractured. So how has Thailand maintained its immunity?
To unlock the mechanics of that immunity, the researcher employs a brilliant, sobering comparative analysis. They place Thailand side by side with its immediate neighbor, Myanmar.
This comparison is the crux of the entire study because the demographic variables are practically identical.
They really are.
Both Thailand and Myanmar are absolute Theravada Buddhist majority nations. And in terms of the minority population in question, the numbers are exactly the same. Both countries have approximately 5.4 million Muslim citizens.
Identical demographics, identical majority religion. Yet the sociopolitical outcomes for those 5.4 million people in each country are violently, tragically divergent. In Myanmar, the Muslim minority, specifically the Rohingya population in Rakhine State, was subjected to extreme systemic state violence that has been internationally recognized as a genocide.
But in Thailand,
while the EVP movement is venomous and active, the state has fundamentally contained the violence. Thailand has avoided deploying the machinery of the state to crush the minority.
So what is the structural difference? Why did the virus of nationalism consume one host and get neutralized by the other?
Well, the researcher identifies 3 specific intertwined mechanisms of resilience, 3 antibodies, basically, that distinguish the Thai system from Myanmar.
Okay, let's go through those antibodies. What's the first one?
The first mechanism is the posture of the state itself regarding perception and inclusion.
Okay.
The researcher argues that, unlike the military junta in Myanmar, the Thai political and royal elite maintain an intentionally inclusive view of the Muslim minority.
And it isn't just passive tolerance either. There is a staggering historical detail in the text that blew my mind when I read it.
Yeah, this is huge.
The researcher notes that the Thai state actually issued an official apology to the Muslim population for the state's mismanagement of past violent conflicts in southern Thailand.
The psychological and political weight of a sovereign state apologizing to a minority cannot be overstated.
It's massive.
An official apology is an admission of fault. It structurally validates the minority group's grievances and explicitly affirms their legitimate place within the national narrative.
And the researchers starkly contrast this with Myanmar, right? Noting that the concept of the state validating minority grievances in such a manner is just utterly non-existent there.
Exactly. And this inclusive perception isn't just symbolic, it dictates the actual mechanics of political power.
Right.
The text emphasizes that Muslim citizens are actively, aggressively courted by all major political parties in Thailand. Parties want Muslim candidates on their tickets. Muslims serve as active ministers in the government cabinet.
Which flows directly into the second mechanism of resilience, institutional integration. Because relying on the goodwill of politicians is fragile, right?
Very fragile. Politicians change.
Exactly. True immunity requires structural bureaucratic permanence. And the researcher highlights a specific institution to demonstrate this, the Chulalachmantri, or the Sheikhul Islam Office.
And the crucial distinction the text makes about the Sheikhul Islam Office is its legal status.
Right.
This is not a civil society organization. It is not an NGO operating on the periphery, holding rallies and hoping a politician reads their press release.
No, it's exactly the opposite. The Sheikhul Islam Office is a deeply entrenched, state-affiliated institution. Its existence and authority are legally protected and formally enshrined within the Thai constitution.
The religious and administrative authority of the Muslim minority has been literally woven into the structural fabric of the state.
Think of it like this. It's the difference between your body trying to fight off a sudden virus by just raising your overall body temperature and hoping for the best, versus having specialized, highly trained T cells permanently stationed within your lymph nodes, constantly monitoring for threats.
That's a great analogy.
The Sheikhul Islam Office acts as that societal T cell. By embedding the minority's voice into the Constitution, you give them a permanent structural defense mechanism.
Right.
They aren't standing outside the building with a megaphone. They have a permanent seat at the executive table, allowing them to directly influence policy and pull the levers of state power when they're threatened.
And that constitutional leverage acts as a massive systemic shock absorber.
Yeah.
When EBP rhetoric flares up, there are official bureaucratic channels to address it before it spills into street violence.
But of course, elite inclusion in constitutional offices only work if the general populace agrees with the system.
Right, which brings us to the third and arguably most decisive mechanism identified by the researcher.
The political failure of EBP.
Yes. The sheer political failure of the exclusionary Buddhist protectionist movement.
This is where the comparison with Myanmar truly crystallizes.
It does.
In Myanmar, Buddhist nationalism successfully infiltrated and captured the political machinery, shaping the actual policy agenda of the state.
But in Thailand, the researcher notes that the EBP movement's ability to act has been severely curtailed precisely because they failed to win over the political apparatus.
And the researcher provides hard data from the latest national elections to prove this, right?
Yes, the political landscape presented a clear test. 3 separate political parties, all explicitly aligned with the ideology of exclusionary Buddhist protectionism, ran for office.
3 separate parties.
Yeah. They attempted to ride this digital wave of religious nationalism straight into parliament.
3 separate parties ran on an exclusionary platform.
Yeah.
And what happened? The text is definitive. All 3 of them failed entirely.
Completely failed.
Not a single Buddhist protectionist party secured enough votes to be elected.
That electoral failure is a profound sociological data point.
It changes the entire equation because it proves that while the EBP movement is incredibly loud, digitally savvy, and capable of isolated sabotage like the halal state, they completely lack a popular mandate. When the majority population, the Thai Buddhists themselves, went into the voting booth and were offered a platform of exclusionary protectionism, they systematically rejected it.
The societal immune system looked at the virus of nationalism and voted it out.
So you have a robust, multi-layered defense, an inclusive elite, constitutional integration of the minority, and a voting public that rejects extremist political platforms.
It is a highly effective macrostructure.
But let's look at the mechanics of a crisis for a second. Macrostructures and constitutional frameworks are inherently slow. Bureaucracy takes time.
Yeah, a lot of time.
What happens when the threat is acute and immediate? What happens when you have a figure like the monk Apichat, who we discussed earlier, logging onto Facebook today, completely bypassing the political parties, ignoring the Constitution, and directly instructing his followers to burn down their neighbors' homes?
Right. How does a slow, bureaucratic immune system react to a sudden, massive infection like that? This is where the researcher moves from analyzing structural resilience to documenting the actual real-time practices of culturing Islamophobia, meaning the direct interventions deployed by the state.
And the handling of the Apichat phenomenon provides the exact blueprint for this.
It really does, because, as you noted, the structural mechanisms were not fast enough to silence him.
No.
The researcher explicitly acknowledges that Muslim civil society, despite its constitutional integration, did not possess the unilateral strength to counter Apichat's dangerous speech on their own.
So how does a secular bureaucratic state neutralize a rogue religious leader who is actively inciting violence?
Through Direct, coordinated, and forceful intervention.
Okay.
When Apichat's rhetoric crossed the threshold from hate speech to actionable, dangerous speech, the Thai state's security apparatus mobilized.
He didn't just put out a press release condemning his word.
No, not at all. Officers from the state's security apparatus physically located him, detained him, and enacted the ultimate structural penalty.
They forced him to disrobe.
Yes, he was defrocked.
Let's examine the mechanics of that, because it is an incredible display of state power. The secular security apparatus, working in tandem with the established religious hierarchy, the Sangha Supreme Council, literally stripped him of the physical symbol of his religious authority.
The text confirms he is no longer a monk.
By removing the robe, they didn't just arrest a man, they conceptually dismantled a demagogue.
Exactly. And the researcher notes that while this decisive action was perhaps quite delayed, allowing him to operate for a perilous amount of time, the mechanism ultimately worked.
Right.
By stripping him of his religious status, they fundamentally fractured his authority, and his influence over the nationalist movement has profoundly decreased.
It demonstrates that when systemic resilience fails, the state retains both the will and the legal mechanism to forcefully excise the threat.
Exactly.
So we have the hard power of the state stepping in to stop violence. But the researcher's final point introduces a completely different mechanism for culturing immunity.
Yes.
It's not about state power laws or arrests. It is about the soft power of human connection, centered around one highly specific, profoundly influential individual mentioned in the text.
The late peace scholar, Professor Chaiwat Satha Anand.
The researcher paints a picture of a man whose personal impact on the ecosystem of Thai peace building is almost immeasurable.
It's incredible.
He wasn't a politician, he was an academic. But the ripple effect of his life's work forms the invisible infrastructure of coexistence in the country.
Professor Chaiwat was a highly prominent Muslim scholar who dedicated his entire career to the academic and practical pursuit of peace and interfaith coexistence.
Right.
But the critical insight the researcher brings forward isn't necessarily about the papers he published. It is about the human network he painstakingly built and left behind.
And the source notes an astonishing fact about that network. Almost all of the significant civil society work currently being done to combat Islamophobia and promote coexistence in Thailand is being led by his former students.
Yes, his students.
And the text makes a vital distinction here. He didn't just teach Muslim students how to defend themselves. He taught everyone.
Yeah.
The researcher points out that a massive portion of the people doing this vital peace-building work are not Muslim, yet they were directly mentored by him.
And the researcher highlights a specific example to illustrate this cross-pollination, an organization known as the Interfaith Body for Peace.
Okay.
This vital organization, dedicated to bridging the religious divide, is currently run by a former student of Professor Chaiwat, who is, themselves, not a Muslim.
His pedagogical reach entirely transcended religious borders.
It really did.
He didn't just build a defense strategy. He built a multi-faith coalition of peace builders who are now deployed across Thai society, actively doing the grueling daily work of countering the exclusionary narratives of the EBP.
Which leads the researcher to pose a deeply philosophical and analytical question, one that serves as the thesis for this entire section of the study. When it comes to actually fighting systemic prejudice on the ground, which mechanism is ultimately more powerful? The production of rigorous academic knowledge, or the sheer, undeniable force of a leader's personality and personal mentorship?
It is the ultimate debate between the text and the teacher. Does a brilliant book change the world? Or does the charismatic person writing the book change the people who actually go out and change the world?
The researcher, drawing on years of exhausting observation in Thailand, takes a definitive stance.
What's the verdict?
They argue that it is unquestionably the latter. The personality, the human element, the personal model of inspiration is the true catalyst for societal change.
Right.
The researcher states plainly that Professor Chaiwat's personal model has served as the core inspiration for both Muslims and non-Muslims working to dismantle Islamophobia.
It was his individual capacity for cross-cultural mentorship that forged the human infrastructure required to fight this ideological war. So when you step back and synthesize all of these distinct mechanisms, the willingness of the state security apparatus to physically defrock dangerous actors, the constitutional permanence of the Sheikhul Islam office guaranteeing a seat at the table, the political maturity of the voting public rejecting extremism, and the sprawling grassroots networks forged by visionary scholars like Professor Chaiwat, you finally see the complete architecture of Thailand's resilience.
It is a profound, incredibly complex, and multi-layered defense system.
It completely redefines how we should look at this issue. Let's recap the intense journey this source material has taken us on, because we've covered a lot of ground.
We really have.
Thailand is not a utopia. It is currently facing a highly organized, digitally weaponized, and historically manipulative movement in exclusionary Buddhist protectionism. This is a movement that digs up thousand-year-old Indian history to frame modern Muslim citizens as existential threats. They are actively utilizing economic sabotage against halal businesses, they are protesting mosques and hijabs, and their leaders have literally used digital platforms to call for arson and warfare.
But crucially, unlike the horrific systemic outcomes we have witnessed in neighboring countries with identical demographic makeups, Thailand has managed to contain the contagion.
Yeah.
They haven't completely eradicated the virus of prejudice. I mean, no society has. But they have successfully cultured an incredibly robust immunity to its most violent state-sponsored manifestations.
And they achieved this not by accident, but through a specific cocktail of inclusion and intervention.
Yes.
They did it by having a state willing to apologize for past wrongs, thereby bringing minorities into the national fold. They did it by institutionalizing minority voices through constitutional bodies, ensuring they never have to scream from the outside because they have a permanent seat inside.
And they did it because the voting public actively, decisively rejected nationalist platforms at the ballot box.
Right. And when all those slow-moving structural systems failed to prevent an acute crisis, the state proved willing to act decisively, deploying its security apparatus to neutralize threats like Apachat.
But underpinning all of this hard structural power is the enduring soft power legacy of cross-cultural mentorship from visionary scholars who dedicated their lives to building networks of empathy.
And here's why every single detail of this meticulous study matters deeply to you, regardless of where you live or what you do.
Absolutely.
Whether you are navigating the fallout of a hyper-polarized national election, or you are simply trying to manage rising toxicity and division within your own workplace, your local school board, or your community organization.
Right. It applies everywhere.
The Thai model, as decoded by this researcher, provides empirical proof that fighting organized hate isn't achieved by just deleting bad posts online or trying to shout louder than the extremists on social media.
No, it proves that true resilience requires systemic, structural inclusion. It requires ensuring that minority or dissenting voices aren't merely tolerated as an afterthought, but are fundamentally integrated into the core decision-making processes of the organization or the state.
Yes, you have to build the T cells into the system before the infection hits.
Exactly.
But it also proves the undeniable, world-shifting power of intentional cross-community mentorship. It highlights the absolute necessity of individuals who are willing to bridge divides, teach those outside their own tribe, and inspire others to carry that work forward.
Those human connections are the most robust immunities any group can cultivate against the virus of division.
It is an ultimately hopeful analysis. It provides a blueprint showing that even when faced with the invisible viral spread of organized digital hate, a society possesses the agency to actively choose resilience over ruin.
It really does.
But I want to leave you with a final lingering thought, a provocation that builds on the researcher's final conclusions, but pushes us to interrogate the future of this immunity.
What is the question?
Well, we just discussed how deeply Thailand's grassroots resilience relies on the sprawling personal networks and the enduring legacy of legendary charismatic figures like the late Professor Chaiwat.
Right.
His personality, his mentorship, his unique ability to inspire trust across deep religious lines. That was the adhesive holding so much of this peace-building civil society together.
And the researcher was clear that they believed that human mentorship was more vital to the cause than the production of academic theory.
Exactly, which leads to a deeply disturbing question. What happens to a society's immunity when those unifying legendary figures inevitably pass away?
Wow.
When the direct students of Professor Chawat eventually age out of the system and retire, what happens to the network?
That's a scary thought.
Can the cold structural institutions, the constitutional offices, the state security policies, the bureaucracy, hold the line against extremism entirely on their own? Or is societal peace not a concrete structure you build once and forget about, but rather a fragile garden that must be constantly obsessively tended? Do we have an obligation to constantly cultivate, elevate, and protect new peace builders and bridge builders to replace the ones we lose, or will the invisible battleground eventually claim us all?
It forces us to ask whether societal immunity is ever a permanent state of being, or if it is a continuous, exhausting, and active process of generational renewal.
Think back to where we started this deep dive. We are not fighting an enemy across a physical border. We are navigating an invisible battleground, a digital landscape where the threat is constantly mutating.
Yeah.
But as the exhausting, brilliant data from Thailand shows us, the cure is equally complex, profoundly human, and relies entirely on our deliberate willingness to build structures of structural inclusion and relentless networks of empathy.
Unpacking the mechanics of this research has been a truly illuminating journey.
It really has. Thank you so much for joining us as we navigated the complexities of this vital study. Keep questioning the historical narratives you're handed. Keep analyzing the mechanisms of the solutions around you. And most importantly, keep diving deep. We will catch you next time.